this room of the Berlin-Brandenburg Academy of Science, you can still see here the historical burden, and we thought that's a good place to talk about peace and security in Europe. Mr. Secretary, today's audience is an indication of the vibrant and diverse transatlantic community in Berlin and Washington, and is represented here today by the American Council in Germany, our sister organization in the US, and our partners for this event, the German Marshall Fund and the Aspen Institute of Germany. Also represented here today are the American Academy, the American Jewish Committee, the American Chamber of Commerce in Germany, and the German Council on Foreign Relations. All these organizations combined form the pillars that are so important for the fostering of our friendship. And in addition, you will find many members of parliament here and representatives of the German business community, from Robert Bosch, from Bayer, or the CEO of Deutsche Bank. They are here today as transatlantic friends. Mr. Secretary, rarely Europe has faced such an imminent threat and a military conflict, and was, as it currently does, in the conflict with Russia. And as in the last 70 years, it's once again the United States of America that feels responsible for peace and security and stability in Europe. If the motto, America is back, which US President Joe Biden presented at the Munich Security Conference last year, needed any proof, we will find it in these difficult days and weeks. Not only the transatlantic community gathered here and online, but also our country and Europe, Mr. Secretary, is grateful to the United States of America for their continued commitment to a peaceful and stable Europe. It's becoming crystal clear these days that the transatlantic partnership is not a relic of the 20th century that lost its importance after the fall of the Iron Curtain. On the contrary, it's precisely in this dawning 21st century that the transatlantic partnership is taking on a new significance. However, and this is clearly lacking in the current conflict with Russia, with a hopefully stronger role for Europe and its member states. For as important as the American commitment to Europe's security and peace is and will remain, the Europeans themselves must carry a larger burden for it. I'm sure, Mr. Secretary, you will now give us important guidance on how we can strengthen the transatlantic community and work together to secure freedom and peace in all parts of Europe. Thank you very much for coming and for your commitment.
Good afternoon. First, let me say how honored I am by the presence of so many friends, colleagues, leaders across different communities here in Germany, and also leaders in the partnership that links our two countries. I'm grateful to all of you for being here, grateful for this opportunity as well to be at the Academy of Sciences and Humanities. I heard a little bit from Sigmar about the history, briefly walked the hallways, and I very much appreciate this hospitality. But it's an institution with an extraordinary tradition of scholarship, discovery, stretching back more than 300 years. And I understand that among other luminaries, Albert Einstein was a member here. So I should probably let you know that my remarks today will include very little about astrophysics, which will be to everyone's benefit. I want to thank all the institutions that are co-hosting us, including Atlantic Brücke. By the way, my own history with the Brücke, the bridge, goes back well more than 20 years. I remember very well spending time with visiting colleagues from Germany during the Clinton administration. But it's a pleasure to be with you, the German Marshall Fund, the Aspen Institute, the American Council on Germany, and I can't not acknowledge a great friend, colleague, going back to my university days, the Clinton administration, the Obama administration, Dan Benjamin. It's wonderful to see you as well. Over the years, these organizations have helped build, strengthen, and deepen the ties between our countries. One of the markers of a strong democracy is a robust, independent civil society. And I'm grateful to our co-hosts for their contributions to democracy on both sides of the Atlantic, and again for bringing us together today. So, as Sigmar said, and as all of you know, I have come to Berlin at a moment of great urgency for Europe, for the United States, and I would argue for the world. Russia is continuing to escalate its threat toward Ukraine. We've seen that again in just the last few days with increasingly bellicose rhetoric, building up its forces on Ukraine's borders, including now in Belarus. Russia's repeatedly turned away from agreements that have kept the peace across the continent for decades. And it continues to take aim at NATO, a defensive voluntary alliance that protects nearly 1 billion people across Europe and North America, and at the governing principles of international peace and security that we all have a stake in defending. Those principles, established in the wake of 2 world wars and a Cold War, reject the right of one country to change the borders of another by force, to dictate to another the policies it pursues or the choices it makes, including with whom to associate, or to exert a sphere of influence that would subjugate sovereign neighbors to its will. To allow Russia to violate those principles with impunity would drag us all back to a much more dangerous and unstable time, when this continent and this city were divided in 2, separated by no man's lands, patrolled by soldiers with the threat of all-out war hanging over everyone's heads. It would also send a message to others around the world that these principles are expendable, and that too would have catastrophic results. That's why the United States and our allies and partners in Europe have been so focused on what's happening in Ukraine. It's bigger than a conflict between 2 countries. It's bigger than Russia and NATO. It's a crisis with global consequences, and it requires global attention and action. Here today, among this rapidly unfolding situation, I'd like to try to cut through to the facts of the matter. To begin, Russia claims that this crisis is about its national defense, about military exercises, weapon systems, and security agreements. Now, if that's true, we can resolve things peacefully and diplomatically. There are steps we can take, the United States, Russia, the countries of Europe, to increase transparency, reduce risks, advance arms control, build trust. We've done this successfully in the past, and we can do it again. And indeed, it's what we set out to do last week in the discussions that we put forward at the Strategic Stability Dialogue between the United States and Russia, at the NATO-Russia Council, and at the OSCE. At those meetings, and many others, the United States and our European allies and partners have repeatedly reached out to Russia with offers of diplomacy in a spirit of reciprocity. So far, our readiness to engage in good faith has been rebuffed. Because in truth, this crisis is not primarily about weapons or military bases. It's about the sovereignty and self-determination of Ukraine and all states. And at its core, it's about Russia's rejection of a post-Cold War Europe that is whole, free, and at peace. For all our profound concerns with Russia's aggression, provocations, political interference, including against the United States, the Biden administration has made clear our willingness to pursue a more stable, predictable relationship, to negotiate arms control agreements, like the renewal of New START, and launch our Strategic Stability Dialogue, to pursue common action to address the climate crisis, and work in common cause to revive the Iran nuclear deal. And we appreciate how Russia has engaged with us in these efforts. And despite Moscow's reckless threats against Ukraine and dangerous military mobilization, despite its obfuscation and disinformation, the United States, together with our allies and partners, have offered a diplomatic path out of this contrived crisis. And that's why I've returned to Europe. Ukraine yesterday, Germany here today, Switzerland tomorrow, where I'll meet with Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov and once again seek diplomatic solutions. The United States would greatly prefer those to be the case, and certainly prefer diplomacy to the alternatives. We know our partners in Europe feel the same way. So do people and families across the continent, because they know that they will bear the greatest burden if Russia rejects diplomacy. And we look to countries beyond Europe, to the international community as a whole, to make clear the costs to Russia if it seeks conflict, and to stand up for all the principles that protect all of us. So let's look plainly at what's at stake right now. Who will actually be affected and who is responsible? In 1991, millions of Ukrainians went to the polls to say that Ukraine would no longer be ruled by autocrats, but would govern itself. In 2014, the Ukrainian people stood up to defend their choice for a democratic and European future. They've been living under the shadow of Russian occupation in Crimea and aggression in Donbass ever since. The war in eastern Ukraine, orchestrated by Russia with proxies that it leads, trains, supplies, and finances, well, that's killed more than 14,000 Ukrainians. Thousands more have been wounded. Entire towns have been destroyed. Nearly 1.5 million Ukrainians have fled their homes to escape the violence. For Ukrainians in Crimea and the Donbass, the repression is acute. Russia blocks Ukrainians from crossing the line of contact, cutting them off from the rest of the country. Hundreds of Ukrainians are being held as political prisoners by Russia and its proxies. Hundreds of families don't know if their loved ones are alive or dead. And the humanitarian needs are growing. Nearly 3 million Ukrainians, including 1 million elderly people and 500,000 children, urgently need food, shelter, and other life-saving assistance. But of course, even Ukrainians who live far away from the fighting are affected by it. This is their country. These are their fellow citizens. And nowhere in Ukraine are people free from Russia's malign activities. Moscow has sought to undermine Ukraine's democratic institutions, interfered in Ukraine's politics and elections, blocked energy and commerce to intimidate Ukraine's leaders and pressure its citizens, used propaganda and disinformation to sow mistrust, launched cyber attacks on the country's critical infrastructure. The campaign to destabilize Ukraine has been relentless. And now Russia is poised to go even further. The human toll of renewed aggression by Russia would be by many magnitudes higher than what we've seen to date. Russia justifies its actions by claiming that Ukraine somehow poses a threat to its security. This turns reality on its head. Whose troops are surrounding whom? Which country has claimed another's territory through force? Which military is many times the size of the other? Which country has nuclear weapons? Ukraine isn't the aggressor here. Ukraine is just trying to survive. No one should be surprised if Russia instigates a provocation or incident and then tries to use it to justify military intervention, hoping that by the time the world realizes the ruse, it'll be too late. There's been a lot of speculation about President Putin's true intentions, but we don't actually have to guess. He's told us repeatedly. He's laying the groundwork for an invasion because he doesn't believe that Ukraine is a sovereign nation. He said it flat out to President Bush in 2008, and I quote, "Ukraine isn't a real country." He said in 2020, and I quote, "Ukrainians and Russians are one and the same people." Just a few days ago, the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs tweeted in celebration of the anniversary of Ukraine and Russia's unification in the year 1654. That's a pretty unmistakable message this week of all weeks. And so the stakes for Ukraine come more fully into view. This is not only about a possible invasion and war. It's about whether Ukraine has a right to exist as a sovereign nation. It's about whether Ukraine has a right to be a democracy. This hasn't stopped with Ukraine. All the former Soviet socialist republics became sovereign nations in 1990 and 1991. One of them is Georgia. Russia invaded it in 2008. 13 years later, nearly 300,000 Georgians are still displaced from their homes. Another is Moldova. Russia maintains troops and munitions there against the will of its people. If Russia invades and occupies Ukraine, what's next? Certainly, Russia's efforts to turn its neighbors into puppet states, to control their activities, to crack down on any spark of democratic expression will intensify. Once the principles of sovereignty and self-determination are thrown out, you revert to a world in which the rules we've shaped together over decades